It was just past 7:00 a.m. when the door to President Ibrahim's office creaked open. The early light of Ouagadougou spilled through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Captain Gail Sankara, head of intelligence, entered silently, his uniform stiff, his expression grim. "Mr. President," he said, voice low. "We have a situation." Ibrahim, dressed in his usual dark tunic, looked up from his tea. "Go on." Captain Sankara approached the desk and laid down a thick brown dossier marked "Confidential. Priority." "This came in late last night. You'll want to read it yourself." Ibrahim opened the folder. The first page alone made his brows furrow. By the third, his hand tightened around the paper. By the fifth, he was standing. This can't be real," he muttered. "It's been verified, triple-checked, cross-referenced with our sources abroad." Sankara said. Inside the dossier were wire transfers, millions of dollars routed through shell corporations in Cyprus, Luxembourg, the British Virgin Islands. The money trail led to contracts disguised as humanitarian aid. But the end recipients were flagged, insurgent groups operating across the Sahel. Ibrahim's jaw clenched. His nation had been bleeding young soldiers ambushed, villages wiped out, families shattered, and now this. The companies behind these transfers, Sankara added, they're tied to American firms. And there's more communications intercepted from Washington. Names you'll recognize. Ibrahim stared out the window at the city below, where children were walking to school, where markets were opening. And yet, a storm had already begun to brew. "If this is true," he said slowly, "then someone at the highest level of a foreign government is complicit in the death of our people." Sankara nodded, including the current White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt. She's authorized at least 3 of these contracts. The president's silence was deafening. He turned back to the dossier and ran a hand over the final page, a transcript of a call between an American intermediary and a local arms dealer. Ibrahim spoke, his voice steady but low. "This isn't just corruption. It's betrayal. Of every soldier we've lost. Of every mother who buried her son." He closed the folder slowly. "Contact the Foreign Ministry. I want an official request sent to Washington directly. Caroline Leavitt will have to answer for this." Captain Sankara saluted, turned, and exited without a word. Ibrahim remained still for a moment, staring down at the dossier in his hands. Whatever innocence remained in global diplomacy had just died in that room, thousands of miles away. The atmosphere in Washington, D.C., couldn't have been more different. Caroline Leavitt stood in front of her mirror, adjusting the collar of her white blazer. Her hair was flawless, her makeup pristine. The young White House press secretary was preparing for another tightly scripted press briefing, a routine she had mastered to perfection. A knock interrupted her moment. Her assistant peeked in, visibly unsettled. "Ma'am, we just received an international call from the president of Burkina Faso." Caroline turned, confused. "Burkina, what Faso?" "President Ibrahim. He says it's urgent." She scoffed. "Tell him I'm busy. I don't do calls from countries I can't spell before coffee." The door closed. She went back to rehearsing her lines, unaware that halfway across the world, someone had just been provoked. Back in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim sat in silence. The rejection was swift. insulting, and deliberate. Not only had Caroline ignored his direct request, she had dismissed his country as irrelevant. He looked at Captain Sankara. She won't talk. She brushed you off. See ya. Publicly, Ibrahim's lips pressed into a thin line. Then we talk to the world. Within hours, a global press conference was arranged. Invitations were sent to major networks, BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, Le Monde. The room was packed. Lights hot. Cameras rolling. Ibrahim stepped to the podium. Calm but unflinching. In his hands, the dossier. Today, he began. I reveal a web of corruption that stretches from the boardrooms of Washington to the battlegrounds of the Sahel. Gasps rippled through the crowd. We have documents, recordings, bank transfers, all pointing to senior officials and private firms in the United States, aiding terrorist organizations under the guise of aid. He held up a document. This transfer, he said, I was authorized by Caroline Leavitt, White House press secretary. It funded a company that supplies weapons to extremists. Across the ocean, Caroline sat in her office, watching the live feed on mute until her name was spoken. She snapped to attention. What did he just say? Her assistant rushed in. Ma'am, CNN just aired it. BBC too. It's going viral. Caroline's face turned pale. This is ridiculous. He's lying. It's political theater. But as she grabbed the remote, flipping through channels, she saw her name everywhere. Ibrahim, on live television, was holding her accountable in front of the world. No more rejections. No more silence. The world had heard his voice, and Caroline Leavitt's name was no longer protected by the White House walls. The press room was suffocating with anticipation. Cameras buzzed. Microphones clicked. And reporters leaned forward like spectators before a verdict. President Ibrahim stood at the podium, calm as a stone. Dossier in hand. This is not about politics. He began. This is about lives. He opened the file and held up the first document. We traced millions of dollars from Western humanitarian funds, redirected to shell corporations, companies registered offshore with no employees, no websites, and no oversight. Behind him, a large screen displayed transaction logs, signatures, and flagged reports. Here, he continued, is the authorization signed by Caroline Leavitt. Whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. He flipped to another page. This contract, he said, approved under her name, funded security operations in regions controlled by insurgents. The money never bought peace, it bought weapons, blood, and silence. In Washington, journalists scrambled. Caroline's face was now a permanent fixture on every screen. Her phone rang nonstop. Her inbox overflowed. Her press team looked to her for guidance, but she was frozen. He's bluffing, she said, voice cracking. There's no way he has this. But Ibrahim wasn't bluffing. He played a leaked audio recording. In the clip, a woman's voice, clear and unmistakably hers, discussed channeling Sahel region investments discreetly. So nobody asks questions. The room fell dead silent. Back at the White House, Caroline shouted at the television. That's taken out of context, her assistant whispered. They want you to respond. Every outlet, even Fox, is running it. Caroline shook her head. I will not dignify that man with a response. He's trying to start a war of words. But the war had already begun, and she was losing it. Ibrahim stayed composed throughout the barrage of questions from international media. One reporter from Reuters asked, "Mr. President, are you accusing the White House of funding terrorism?" "I am accusing individuals who use democracy's name to disguise corruption," Ibrahim said. "The people of America deserve the truth just as much as the people of Burkina Faso," another journalist pressed. "Will you be sending this evidence to American authorities?" Ibrahim nodded. "Our justice begins with transparency. Everything will be handed over to the Federal Bureau of North America by week's end." And just like that, the world had shifted. One man, armed with truth, had challenged a global narrative and named names. As Ibrahim left the stage, the dossier still in his grip, the headlines were already forming: "African President Accuses U.S. Official of Funding Terror with Receipts." And Caroline Leavitt's name had just become international front-page scandal. The West Wing had never been so tense. Phones rang without pause. Aides rushed down hallways. Papers in hummed, whispering and glancing nervously at screens flashing headlines from across the globe. Inside her office, Caroline Leavitt stood frozen, hands clenched on the edge of her desk. Every network, CNN, BBC, even Fox, had looped the same footage: President Ibrahim, poised and unshaken, exposing her by name, with irrefutable documents. She slammed her fist on the desk. "Why is no one shutting this down?" An aide stepped forward hesitantly. "We've tried, Mum. But the documents he showed, they're authentic. Independent analysts are confirming them. It's not just a PR issue anymore." Her mouth dropped slightly. Who gave him those files? No one had an answer. Moments later, her chief of staff rushed in. "We're being flooded. The Hill is demanding answers. Senate Republicans are asking if you forged contracts. The DNC wants a closed-door briefing. And the president, he wants to see you now." Caroline's defiance cracked. She grabbed her coat, muttered something under her breath, and stormed out. Reporters were already gathering outside the press room, shouting questions, their microphones like daggers. "Miss Leavitt, did you authorize illegal transfers? Are you resigning? Is the White House funding terrorism in Africa?" She said nothing. At that same moment, Ibrahim's team in Ouagadougou released another set of documents. Wire transfers linked directly to Caroline's family foundation, money funneled through consulting firms with vague missions and zero deliverables. Social media erupted. Hashtags like #Leavitt Leaks and #Dossier of Truth trended globally. Even loyal conservative voices began to falter. On Fox News, a visibly uncomfortable anchor tried to spin the narrative. "This may just be a foreign leader playing political games," he said. But even he seemed unconvinced. Meanwhile, inside the Oval Office, President Chu was livid. "You told me there was nothing to worry about," he barked at Caroline. "I didn't think it would go this far," she replied, her voice brittle. Chu turned away from her, shaking his head. "You underestimated him, and now he's dragging this administration into a geopolitical nightmare." Back in Burkina Faso, Ibrahim refused to gloat. "This isn't personal," he told his cabinet. "But when blood is spilled with money meant to save lives, silence is not an option." Caroline returned to her office and shut the door. Her press briefings were suspended, her public appearances canceled. For the first time in her career, the podium stood empty. and so did her defense. President Ibrahim didn't pause, not even for celebration. The press may have moved on to the next breaking story. But for him, this wasn't a media event. It was justice in motion. He turned to Captain Sankara in the Situation Room. "Prepare the next dossier." Ibrahim said calmly, "This time, deliver it directly to the U.S. Ambassador. I want the truth in their hands, no filters." Sankara nodded and left without a word. The new documents were devastating. They included internal memos from Caroline Leavitt's office, signed security consulting contracts, worth millions contracts for services that were never rendered. Instead, the funds had been quietly transferred to accounts in Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, and one unregistered company in the UAE. A paper trail so tangled, it screamed deliberate concealment. Sankara handed the sealed folder to the American ambassador personally. Within hours, the leak hit the press. The Wall Street Journal published a front-page exposé titled "Aid or Arms: The Secret Trail of U.S. Dollars in West Africa." CNN aired a full segment analyzing audio clips of Caroline discussing alternative funding flows for sensitive operations. The pressure mounted. In Virginia, Caroline Leavitt stayed holed up in her home, declining all media requests, refusing to speak even to her closest allies. Her lawyer, Marcus Thompson, attempted damage control in a press conference outside her gated community. "My client categorically denies all allegations," he said, flanked by security. But reporters weren't buying it. "Then how do you explain the recordings, the wire transfers?" Thompson dodged, sweat forming at his collar. "We believe this is a coordinated international smear campaign." Meanwhile, Ibrahim's stock on the world stage surged. The African Union released a public statement applauding his unwavering commitment to transparency. France, Germany, and even China voiced support. In a phone call, President Xi told Ibrahim, "Your courage strengthens the world's fight against financial corruption." Still, Ibrahim remained clear. This is not about nations. It's about the lives we've lost to silence and greed. More evidence surfaced: photos of Caroline at closed-door dinners with arms brokers, meeting minutes with intermediaries known for laundering money. Even her encrypted email server was subpoenaed. The FBI, under pressure from both Congress and the international community, officially opened a preliminary investigation. Suddenly, Caroline's position was not just politically untenable, it was legally indefensible. And as she watched her world collapse from behind drawn curtains, President Ibrahim prepared one final statement. This is not revenge. This is responsibility. Because the truth, once awakened, refuses to sleep again. The walls were closing in. Caroline Leavitt, once hailed as the golden voice of American conservatism, had become a ghost in her own home. Her face, once framed perfectly behind the White House podium, was now plastered on headlines with words like fraud, scandal, and terror ties. She hadn't left her Virginia residence in over a week. Outside, news vans circled like vultures. Protesters gathered by the gate, holding signs that read, "How many lives did your money cost? And you funded terror with our taxes." Inside, Caroline paced in silence. Makeup smudged, hair undone. The empire she built with smiles and sound bites had crumbled in 6 days. "I'm not a criminal," she whispered. "I'm not the villain." But the mirror didn't believe her. Then came the final blow. President Ibrahim released a new audio clip, Caroline's voice, caught in a private dinner conversation. Laughing with foreign investors, those Africans will never find out where the money goes. They don't even have real cybersecurity. The internet exploded. Within hours, hashtags like #racist receipts and #colonial corruption were trending. Civil rights groups called for her arrest. Even former allies turned their backs. Fox News dropped their defense. The White House distanced itself. In an emergency press statement, President Chu declared, Miss Leavitt acted in a personal capacity. Her decisions do not reflect the values of this administration. Translation: You're on your own. Caroline slammed her laptop shut and screamed. They're all cowards, but no one was listening anymore. That night, she attempted a quiet grocery run, hood pulled up, sunglasses on. But the moment she stepped out of her SUV, flashbulbs blinded her. Caroline, did you finance terrorist activity? Are you resigning or running? Why did you lie to the American people? She panicked. Are you resigning? Are you just terrorist activity? Are you resigning or running? Why did you lie to the American people? Shielded her face with her coat. Ran back to her vehicle. Fumbling for the lock, the footage aired worldwide. Once the queen of press briefings, Caroline Leavitt now looked like a fugitive chased by her own truth. Across the Atlantic, Ibrahim watched the clip from his office. Aides waited for a reaction. But he simply said, I don't enjoy her fall. I just regret what it cost to get here. The next morning, the Department of Justice announced a formal criminal investigation. Caroline's accounts were frozen. Her digital platforms deleted. Her attorney issued a desperate statement. My client believes she is being targeted because of her race, her gender, and her loyalty to this administration. But America wasn't buying it. The narrative had flipped, and the girl who once silenced critics could no longer silence the facts. Caroline Leavitt was unraveling. Her bank accounts were frozen. Her home surrounded by reporters and federal investigators. Her social media wiped clean. Days earlier, she'd been one of the most recognizable faces in American politics. Now, she couldn't even order takeout without someone yelling traitor through her window. Her lawyer, Marcus Thompson, urged her to stay calm. We can still argue media bias. We can claim political targeting. But if you flee, Caroline, if you even try, it's over. She didn't listen. Late one evening, she whispered into her phone, I have to leave this country. I can't survive like this. Using forged documents purchased on the black market, she booked a flight to Toronto under a false name. She arrived at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport wearing a scarf and oversized coat. She made it through the first security checkpoint. Her eyes darted nervously as she clutched a fake passport. Boarding gate in sight. Then Caroline Leavitt, a voice barked. She froze. 4 federal agents closed in. Cameras flashed as passengers gasped. You are under federal investigation. You are not permitted to leave the country. The lead agent said firmly. The footage aired live within the hour. The former White House press secretary arrested like a criminal. In public, bags on the floor, hands shaking. Across the ocean, President Ibrahim received the news with quiet resolve. Let this serve as a warning, he told his ministers. Truth travels farther than silence. Within days, Caroline was transferred to a federal detention facility, no bail, due to flight risk. And then came the trial. The courtroom buzzed with global media. Every seat was filled. Headlines around the world followed the case breathlessly. Ibrahim's dossier was now official evidence. Prosecutors laid it out clearly. Millions in misappropriated funds, fake consulting contracts, offshore transfers, and classified leaks. Swiss banks confirmed transactions. Intelligence officers testified about counter-terrorism missions compromised by leaked info. Former White House staffers admitted they had suspicions, but never imagined this. Even Caroline's old colleagues, once loyal, now pointed fingers. She always talked about investments in Africa. One testified, but never said what they were for. The defense scrambled, but the facts were relentless. By week 3, the judge refused another delay. Caroline sat at the defendant's table, eyes hollow, shoulders hunched. This wasn't about politics anymore. It was about betrayal, greed, lives lost because of whispered deals in back rooms. And the woman who once stood behind the most powerful podium in the world now faced the full weight of justice without a podium to hide behind. The world was watching. Inside the packed federal courtroom, the air was thick with tension. Journalists lined the walls. Cameras flashed outside. Protesters filled the streets beyond the courthouse gates. Some held signs that read, "Justice for the innocent." Others, "No one is above the law." Caroline Leavitt sat still, her once confident posture reduced to a nervous slump, her hair tied back, no makeup, hands trembling in her lap. For the first time in her life, she was no longer in control of the narrative. Across from her, the prosecution stood with quiet certainty. They had built the case like a fortress brick by brick. Money laundering, leaking classified intel, financing terror. Every charge backed by hard data, testimony, and foreign cooperation. And then came the final witness, a child, a 12-year-old boy from Burkina Faso, appearing via live stream. His school, one of the many shut down after Caroline's approved contracts, drained funds meant for education. His voice cracked as he held up a notebook, with no pages left to write on. "She took our school away," he said simply. The courtroom fell silent. Even Caroline looked away. The jury returned that afternoon. 12 Americans, sworn to weigh truth against lies, stepped back into the room. No one breathed as the foreman handed the slip to the judge. Judge Morrison read slowly. On the counts of money laundering, conspiracy, and willful financing of terrorism, we find the defendant, Caroline Marie Leavitt, guilty on all charges. Gasps, shouts. One woman in the back burst into tears. Caroline's face went blank. No words. No reaction. Just a long, vacant stare into nowhere. The judge continued. Due to the severity of these crimes and the irrefutable global consequences, this court sentences the defendant to 45 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for the first 25. Cameras outside captured the crowd's reaction cheers, mixed with somber silence. From Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim addressed the nation in a televised speech. Today is not about vengeance. It is about accountability. We have proven that justice knows no borders, and no title can protect corruption from truth. His words echoed around the globe. And in that moment, the world shifted not because a woman fell, but because a continent rose. Caroline was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs. No press badge. No podium. No applause. Just the cold footsteps of justice and the distant sound of a nation finally being heard. The Caroline Leavitt verdict sent shockwaves across continents. In Washington, stunned silence hung over the Capitol. No spin. No denial. Just the weight of consequences. Former allies now scrambled to erase ties. One senator, once photographed beaming beside Caroline, claimed, "I never truly knew her." Even President Chu, famous for backing his team to the bitter end, "I gave a hollow statement to the press." Miss Leavitt's actions were her own. The administration had no knowledge of her dealings. But it was too late. The pictures, the contracts, the evidence, it all lived online now. And no press secretary could edit this ending. Meanwhile, the impact overseas was seismic. In France, officials launched investigations into similar shell companies. Germany froze accounts connected to offshore African operations. In London, authorities raided offices tied to the money laundering web. And in Burkina Faso, where it all began, change was sweeping the streets. President Ibrahim stood at the balcony of the National Assembly, addressing a crowd of thousands, waving flags and holding signs that read, "Justice wins and truth has no borders. We have shown the world," he declared, "that Africa is no longer silent, that our voices carry weight, that when we fight with facts and dignity, we are heard." The people roared. But Ibrahim wasn't celebrating. Behind the podium, his face remained serious. Because for him, this wasn't just about Caroline. It was about every buried scandal, every silenced whistleblower, every child who deserved a school instead of a war zone. His ministers briefed him later that night. International NGOs are requesting cooperation. The World Bank wants to audit previous aid programs. We've received over 40 calls from heads of state. Ibrahim nodded, then simply said, "This is only the beginning." Back in the U.S., Caroline sat inside her holding cell, alone. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The walls were cold. Her name, once trending for ambition and eloquence, was now synonymous with betrayal. She stared at the small metal table in front of her. A newspaper slid through the door. The front page showed President Ibrahim, standing tall, beneath the words, "The African President, who took on the West and won." She didn't read the rest, because for the first time in her life, there was nothing she could say. No press release. No spin. No deflection. Just silence, and the distant echo of justice she never saw coming.